musician who sits in Mali and listens to a lament from Kashmir can immediately pick up cadences that make sense on that kora. And in search of a history that has never been written about the traveling of musical forms. Are we encountering similar type of surprises in the field between Africa, South Africa, and India?
And I think there's certainly, a very rich and wonderful work that yet remains to be done. Some of it, I think, quite unexpected. One, and it's about, I think, the complexity of transnationalism within the global South. So it's not thinking about the normal kinds of circuits that we're used to thinking, kind of colonial or north-south circuits. So, for example, you get a wonderful examples of Gujarati romances about Africa. Okay? So they follow very much the formula of the colonial romance novel, but they are written from the perspective of Gujarati characters in Zanzibar, often set in Zanzibar. And it seems to me that's a really interesting aesthetic use of the Indian Ocean, which sets things off beam. Okay? It kind of completely disorients you in some ways and makes you rethink all of the kinds of categories that you normally take for granted.
And in the socio-political comparisons, apart from, let's say that there is no Mandela in India at the moment and no Nehru in South Africa, what do you think travels between the two societies? And what do you think ought to be looked at or has been looked at?
For the comparison, there's a really interesting chapter in the book that talks about the democratic consolidation and deepening. And in this chapter, it's by a guy named Patrick Heller. He shows how both places in South Africa and India, they've experienced extraordinary democratic consolidation, but they've actually not experienced democratic deepening. Basically what he's arguing is that people struggle to practice democracy in both places. And why is that? Well, he looks at the different contexts, the different places, but then says, well, a lot of it has to do with the vertical and horizontal logics of state institutions that are in some ways antithetical to democratic deepening. There's institutions that are very good for democratic consolidation, but not for democratic deepening. And he says that, basically the balance of power with the civil society and the state for these things don't help you. The one that's good for democratic consolidation is not good for democratic deepening. And I think in this comparison, if you were just to look at the one, it might seem like there's an idiosyncratic situation of South Africa or India. And only when you look at the comparison between the two, do you actually get an appreciation that maybe there's something more going on about the way the institutions are formed, the role of institutions in these processes. There's also, I think, a really interesting piece by someone who looks at migrants and shows how there was different histories of migration. Both places experienced extraordinary labor migration. But in the South African case, as everyone here would know, there was a lot of institutional coercion around migrancy, whether people got to stay in urban areas or were sent back to rural areas. And there's a very different logic happening in the Indian case. And so there's been there was a much stronger encouragement of maintaining these links between the urban and the rural. And so migrancy itself hasn't necessarily always been a migrancy to the urban, but it's also been a migrancy back to the rural. And I think when you look at comparison, the whole point of a comparative project is to try to take what might seem as an exceptional experience in one location, and when you look at it comparatively, you see that there's actually extraordinary similarities and differences, and you learn more about each one through that comparison.
And what were the biggest challenges in putting the material together? What haunts you?
Our colleagues. We had one colleague who we adore, but for about 6 months he would see us, he's at this, and he would see us in the passageways and run the other way. He avoided us, so it was really yeah, those pundits would probably know.
Beyond this too.
Could I say a different sort of a book like this always produces a feeling of intellectual vertigo because, it's such a huge field and it's so exciting, and one sort of trying to cross this chasm with, kind of a couple of flimsy pieces of paper. So you're so aware of, of the enormity of the field, and you're trying to capture that, but you can only also include very few pieces. I think it's kind of what's not there, what's left out, and what is yet to be written.
So, before we pass the microphone that side, what's volume 2?
I think volume 2 would be a wonderful thing on the role of Africa and India in each other's imaginations. And I think, just picking up on your comments earlier, there's so much interpenetration once you start to look at ideas of race and caste. There's this idea that Africa has race, India has caste. Africa has slavery, India produces indentured labour. But of course, those categories are constructed in and through each other's. Indian and African nationalism are deeply imbricated in each other. Gandhi, for example, uses the idea of Africa as the boundary of his imagination of India. Now, I've been doing some very interesting research on Anglo-Boer. During the Anglo-Boer War, there were Boer prisoners, 9,000 Boer prisoners in India. And they spent their time in these internment camps discussing the idea of the Boer Republic. What should it be? What might it have been? What could it be in the future? And of course, their boundary that they take there for the Boer Republic are the Indian servants who have been given to them, because they are deemed to be white men, but they're in captivity, but they are so you have this very interesting sense of interactions. And also I just think that the whole, also looking at the Indian Ocean, upsets deeply these categories. You have to think about what does Indian slavery mean, what does African indenture mean, what is who is a settler.
I should actually say that this whole project began with Isabel starting this originally the thrust at FITS on India and South Africa. And I had just arrived at FITS, and so she incorporated me into this. And it was this extraordinary intellectual environment, just very loose about people who study South Africa and India. And then we came up with, we came up with the idea of maybe doing an edited volume together. And we had this first workshop. And we just kind of put together people who are working on this. And it was extraordinary to actually see, because I'm a sociologist and she does African literature, so to bring these very interdisciplinary workshops together, and it just worked. But as Isabel said, there was so many people we excluded that I think that we could very easily do a second volume and include a lot more.
Thank you. Questions?
Thank you. I have only read bits and pieces of the book, but I've read a great deal of the scholarship around it. And the point that I find the most exciting about the work that takes on board circulation, traveling, looking at India and South Africa together, is not so much the comparative, which I think is fantastic, and I think the mutual imbrication is extraordinary. But I think that you've moved us, you and others who work in a similar dimension, somewhere where I haven't been, because I've been aware of the weight of scholarship which has asked me to think about nationalism, or asked me to think about imagined communities. And I recognize that you're starting to position us in another space in which we're looking at the millions of people who live in an interstitial space or live askance to those major identities